Hello and welcome to Season 2 of the Teacher's Journey podcast. I'm your host, Brian Costello, here to talk with some incredible educators and hear the stories that have made them who they are today. Welcome back to the Teacher's Journey podcast. I'm your host, Brian Costello, and incredibly excited to be joined this evening by the talented and unbelievable and incredibly busy Rachelle Dene Poth from Riverview High School, just outside Pittsburgh. Teacher of almost everything you could think of, but more specifically Spanish, STEAM, law, French, other things. We'll find out more about it in just a little bit. So thanks so much for joining us, Rachelle, and glad you could be here.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk with you.
Absolutely. There's lots and lots of things that you do, and lots of things that you and I have connected over in the past. And I'm just kind of excited to kind of see how we got to that point, because you have sort of an interesting resume, interesting list of things and accomplishments that you've gone through. So I can't wait to find out how we got there. So I guess start us off by just talking about when you decided you wanted to become a teacher, when you wanted to go into education.
Oh, that's a heavy question for the start, it's funny because that is part of what I have been writing and working on, is thinking back over, like, how did I get to where I am today? And you think about, like, what if I had done one thing differently? Or, like, for me, a big changing thing in my life was going to law school, which I could tell you more about another time. But that is kind of really where I started to get, like, my passion for teaching. But when I was in college, I went to Penn State and I took courses in French and really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. But somehow I ended up kind of going into the direction of education. And I did have some members of the family that were educators. I had an aunt who taught English, an uncle who also taught English. Some were a school psychologist or guidance counselor. And so there was kind of like that foundation there that was already set. And then when I was a kid, I loved to play school. So whether or not any of that had an impact on, like, the decision later. But I remember my junior year of undergrad at Penn State and sitting in the guidance counselor's office and just trying to think, like, what was I going to do for my degree? Because up to that point, I was still in liberal arts, but undecided. And we talked about options, and they recommended that I just take some courses, just like basic in education, just to find out. And so that's where I got my start. And then when I graduated, I could not get a job just teaching French, and actually had to go back to school for a couple of years and substitute during that time, and got my degree in Spanish. Once that happened, then I think it was like 3 years that I was a substitute, and finally found a position that was 3 periods a day for half of the year. And then the man who had been teaching there retired. And so then I interviewed for the job and was hired for that fall. And now, like 22 years later, which is hard to believe, here I am. So it's been interesting, varying points throughout it. I think, like with every profession, every job that you have, you're going to question, like, how did I get here? Like, am I supposed to be here? Do I want to do something different? And I asked myself those many times over the years, but probably since I was in law school, and definitely over the past 4 or 5 years, I've really started to find my why. And, like, I love what I do now. And I can say, like I used to say it was the job, and I really didn't like the job that much. And I think when I started to look at it differently and not as a job, and making some connections, and there's a lot more to it along the way, is, it kind of, that passion kind of evolved over time. But it wasn't, I wish I could say, like, oh, I always want to be a teacher, because I have friends that say that, like, that's just been their whole life passion. But for me, it's been kind of like a work in progress. But now I can say, yeah, like, I want to be a teacher. Like, I love what I do.
Yeah. And that's interesting. I think, like, there are definitely hints towards you being an educator, being, like, you have some of those common things that you're talking about, like playing school a lot and loving, and enjoying your classes and things like that, that I've heard from other people who've always wanted to be educators. So it's like, I knew right away I wanted to be an educator, and, like, I had no clue. I actually knew I didn't want to be a teacher, and that was obviously really wrong. I'm pretty good at not knowing what I want to do, apparently. But yeah, it's so. So what was it about the course load in college? Like, when you started taking the classes, like, was it Because a lot of people talk about, oh, they had this moment, like this was the thing that really convinced me that teaching was my thing. Whereas it seems like for you, it was more of like, it was a gradual build up as opposed, like it wasn't one of those, like, wasn't a moment. It was more of a, you kept pushing towards it, and then all of a sudden you look back and there it was.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's exactly how I think of it. I know when I think about the whole time, like preparing to become a teacher and then student teaching, substituting, and then where I've been now, I can think of a couple of times over, the last, I guess now almost 25-ish years, somewhere around there, that
we'll call it 10.
Yeah. I know that we had to do, student teaching like the whole semester. We also had to do like observations, and we went to different schools. And I knew that I didn't want to be an elementary school teacher. I don't know. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy it. Honestly, the experiences that I had when I had to go into those classrooms at State College, I loved it. Like I was so excited to go in and work with those kids and just to have them, like they just needed help and they were so excited to learn. And I just thought it was like the greatest thing ever.
You're like, I can't handle that. All that excitement to learn and get away from me.
It was tiring. But the thing
exhausting.
was, oh yeah, I always say, and it's funny because like elementary teachers will say to high school teachers, like, I don't know how you do it. And we say to elementary, like, we don't know how you do it.
But they say to us middle school teachers, you're all insane.
It's tough. I mean, it gets more difficult every year. But for me, the thing that changed it more was that I was kind of majoring in French. And, the likelihood at that time, elementary schools really didn't have foreign language programs. And so for me to find a job, my certification was going to be more like the upper end rather than, a K through 12.
Elementary French was going to be a hard shoot.
Yeah. Now, not a problem. I mean, they are moving it more down, but, you're talking, 1991, 92. So no, it wasn't. I mean, we did teach the kids some French back at that time, which was kind of fun. To hear them speak it. But so that experience and my student teaching experience too were times where I really felt like, like I was connecting and I enjoyed what I was doing. And it started me to like really, I guess it gave me a chance to like think about it differently because I was out there. I wasn't just reading from a book or hearing about somebody else talking about what it's like to be a teacher. I think when I had that connection, that's when it became like real.
Yeah, that makes a big difference. I think for everybody is really being in the classroom and you can't really understand what it's like to be a teacher I don't want to take away from stories about teaching. I'm a big proponent about telling your stories, but there's something different about being there in person.
Right.
And getting that firsthand experience of what it's like. So when you walked into your classroom, like your actual first classroom, what was that like? Like, I mean, when you first, so you said you were like a 3.5 period, like a half day teacher. Mm-hmm. When you first started doing that, what was it like for you to walk into a classroom day one, year one? Like,
it was tough because, I went in January, like the semester, and it was 3/8 period because there were 8 periods at a time, and it was the end of the day. So it was kind of nice for me. I don't even remember. I think I had classes in the morning. I was finishing up my Spanish certification, luckily at that time. But I went in and I didn't have my own classroom. So it was 3 different rooms, none of which really were, none of which were really, set up like a language, like I couldn't really make them my own space, I guess. One of them was a computer lab. One was a side room off of the library. And one room was connected to 2 other rooms, like where if you wrote on the chalkboard and somebody next to you said, hey, could you give me a piece of chalk? You could slide it because it was one long board space between the 3 rooms. So it made it a little bit more difficult. However, now I think about it, the one class was like a Spanish 4 and 5 combo. I had 6 students. And it was in this side room and there were these plain walls and they just started using like, I guess erasable markers or something, putting pictures up and decorating it. So it actually had like some substance and character to it. So that kind of helped. But
those were permanent markers. It never came off. Yeah,
probably. I've had that done before. But it was hard. You go into a space and you go into a classroom and it's not your own. And you don't really feel like you can make it your own, or you don't have that like connection to it. And so it just feels like, like I'm standing up in the middle of a store and trying to teach a lesson like, hey, while you're waiting in line, No, it's not. It wasn't that bad, but there's
kind
not
of
always.
equated to living in a hotel room, right? Like
Yeah.
when you spend a lot, especially when you travel a bit and you get to spend a lot of time on the road, and you realize like hotel rooms are really nice, and it's nice to go stay in a hotel room for a couple of days, but to stay in a hotel room for a couple of months is not nice. Like that's not where you want to be. And so,
Right.
it'd be fun for a couple of days, but realistically, long term, it's nice to have a space to call your own, and that's got to be difficult, especially starting out.
Yeah.
When you're trying to really cement who you are as a teacher and what you do.
Mm-hmm.
And so talk about then when you got to that point. So like you said, after a little bit, you got a chance to take that position full time.
Mm-hmm.
When did you start to feel like, okay, I get it. This is mine. Like take some ownership, I guess, of what you did and your space and everything else.
It took a while because like in a smaller school, there were a lot of teachers that traveled. Some of them used carts. And my first, I think it was it might have been 3 years until I had my own classroom, definitely 2. And so, it wasn't like I was just going room to room. It was like upstairs, downstairs. One time I taught in a computer lab room. And so some of the students were actually facing, around the wall, and I had to move around the room. So it did present some challenges, both within the classroom during the period, but also in terms of getting from one class to the other. I think it's so important to be there to greet the students and to have your space set up. And that ends up trickling down to having an impact on classroom management, as well as having that own space where you feel like you can have, I don't want to say authority, because like I feel like words like authority and being the leader and all of that, I think some of those are so, and that's a bad word to say too, not even outdated, but I think the language has changed some. So,
but I know what you mean. I
think,
it's more like it's not necessarily authority, but it's a space in which you have the ability to create this. You have some ability and some, and I think control is not the wrong word. There's some control over the way in which you create the environment.
right.
You're not necessarily trying to control everything that they do, but you are trying to set up an environment that has some stability, that is welcoming. And when you're moving from place to place, your ability to have that ready for kids when they walk in the door,
Mm-hmm.
that stability and comfort level and just the environment that you want to create that sets up the type of learning that you want to have in your room isn't there when you're using someone else's space and when you're moving from place to place, and becomes very difficult. So I totally understand that, that would be a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when does law school come into this? I'm kind of curious. So so how did that come to, is that something that happened like randomly in the middle or?
Yeah, kind of gosh, I think, well, I mean, short version of it would be I loved reading John Grisham novels and just was fascinated by the law. I was already teaching. At some point, I considered possibly getting my certificate for being a paralegal. I don't know why, but there was a program at Duquesne where they had that. And so I checked into it, but they only offered it during the day and I was already teaching. So I was like, okay. I thought I could do it like at night or in the summer, but it wasn't like that. So I kind of let that go. And then while I was taking the courses for Spanish to get my certification, a couple of them, I also got involved in the translation program because I wanted to become a certified translator. So I took French and Spanish like translation courses, a couple of which focused on legal translation. So I started to get a little bit more kind of interested in like the law and seeing the connection with the languages. And one of my teachers was actually, forget what her position was, but she worked for John Deere as like one of their attorneys or something. And I got really interested in it. And I thought, okay, I'll take the LSAT and see what happens. So I took it, and like with every standardized test, you get your score. You're like, I don't even know what that means compared to anybody else. So I think I was like 26, 5 or something like that at the time. So I let it go. And then a couple more years went by and the scores were kind of invalidated. So I had to take it again. I think I was like 32 at the time.
That's when I fully committed that I wasn't going. When the scores were invalidated, I'm like, yeah, definitely not law school anymore.
Yeah, I know. And my biggest
take that test again. That was an awful test.
Oh yeah, it was. And I bought the study guides and I studied and I thought, you know what? I don't want to end up someday thinking like, I wonder if. So I took it and looked into the programs. Pitt did not have an evening program, but Duquesne did because I couldn't quit teaching. And so I didn't even tell, I took the test. I didn't tell my husband, didn't tell my parents that I applied. I just kind of did all this line. I thought, you know what? If I get accepted, great. I'll decide. If I don't, then I know. Well, then I got accepted. And this was, I had already been teaching. I think it was 2002 was when I went. So I was already at my school 5 years. And I wasn't doing it to get out of teaching. It was just kind of like I wanted to see if I could maybe. So I decided and I went and I taught full time. It was 4 years, 4 nights a week, 4 different classes. So I was kind of like living in school. I finished in 2006. I took the bar. I passed it the first time, which thankfully that is not a test you want to have to take more than one time, like 16 hours. And, but I gave it everything that I had. I don't even know what the score was that I passed the bar with. It just mattered that I passed.
Yeah, it doesn't matter with that one. It just matters that you get there and
right.
Yes, right.
But man, the waiting. We took it in July, and this is why I think feedback is so important. We took it in July, and you didn't find out until November. So It was like grueling. You're like waiting. But for me, it's not that it didn't matter the waiting because I wasn't going to quit teaching. That was what ideally, I would like to teach law in addition to actually being in the classroom. So a lot of people thought that I would quit teaching. A lot of people thought I didn't like teaching, but it wasn't that. It was just like a personal thing for me. I wanted to challenge myself because I didn't feel like I challenged myself much, my prior education experiences.
That's interesting. And I'm curious. So when you think about that experience and the decision to go in and in that direction, do you think that had what kind of impact do you think that had on your teaching style, your teaching ability, your ability to be who you are in the classroom? Like what if any impact do you think that might have had?
It's funny that you asked that because I think, and I've said this many times to people, is I don't think that I would be the teacher that I am today, not qualifying that in any way, but it made me realize what it means to be a teacher, the way I had been teaching. I was looking at it more as, like I said, like a job, but learning, sitting as a student, and I was really uncomfortable and I felt out of my league so often in comparison with other people in the class. That uncomfortable feeling when when the teacher calls on you and you're like, I have no idea what the answer is. And you say, I don't know. And then they wait an hour and a half and they're waiting for you, like literally an hour and a half. I had a 3-hour experience trying to answer a question in contract law. And, but it made me really
just waited for you to look it up and find it.
Oh, it was unbelievable. It was like, it is one of my favorite experiences of law school. And, it's just a funny story. It wasn't so funny at the time. It was kind of like, oh my goodness, but it was a lesson to be learned about preparing. That saying I don't know isn't going to get you out of it. It's like,
well, don't skip the good stuff. Tell it what happened.
I was in contract law, and they use the Socratic method a lot, which was not anything that I had ever heard of. I tend to read and reread things over and over. And I knew, he was going alphabetically. So I knew that night I would have to kind of, prepare a case and answer his questions. But most people, when they go through school, a lot of times what you're doing is kind of like a low-level recall or maybe a little bit over kind of analyzing things. And I knew every single case in and out. I knew the rules of law. I knew everything except for the way he was going to twist the questions. And I had no idea what he was asking. And my friends were trying to whisper things to me. And he was in the front of the room, facing the board, hand on his head, red in the face. I was clearly causing him some serious frustration because I didn't know the answer. It was kind of funny because not funny. There are people who would cry, he may cry in class because he was very, like his way of speaking, it was kind of scary.
Just made you feel awful about yourself.
It did, but I said, oh my God, he's not going to make me cry. And at one point he said, and he always called me Poth. And I'm like, okay. And at one point he said, Poth, or what you're saying, blah, blah, blah. And I said, honestly, I have no idea what I'm saying. I don't know at this point. And I'm looking at the clock, and the class went from 6 until 9, and it was like 5 to 9. And he had started asking me at 7:30. And I'm thinking, okay, 5 more minutes and we'll be done. 5 minutes goes by, and he says, okay, well, next week we'll pick up with Poth, and maybe she'll know the answers. I was like, oh my gosh.
Oh, man.
Yeah. So the next week it was about an hour and 15 minutes, and I knew the answers, but he just kept going and going and going. And then after that class that night, he saw me on the way out, and, he talked to me a little bit, and I enjoyed it. It was a great learning experience. It was funny for everybody else, even for me now looking back on it. But it let me realize, many times in the past, students would say, I don't know, or call on somebody else or whatever. And a lot of times I would just let them get away with that, because I remember what it felt like to not know and be embarrassed if you didn't have the right answer. And I said to one of my students a couple of weeks ago, I said, you know what? In law school, it was 3 hours waiting for an answer from me. So I go, I have all day. I said, I am really patient. But I don't know, it just started me on a way to think differently about what it's like to be a student. And then I had some professors who really cared about you. You would walk in, they'd be behind piles of books and cases and whatever. Many of them were practicing attorneys. And it didn't matter. Like, you showed up and you had a question. It was like everything disappeared from the desk. And I thought, why am I not doing this myself? Like, I'm a high school teacher. I don't have all this stuff. So I really do credit like the changes that I made.
Except you had, mountains of law school work to do at the time. But yeah, it's the same thing, But I think that's really interesting, because when I think about what you say, and I work in a computer lab, and the kids sometimes will ask me questions. I'm like, why would you ask me that? Like, you are literally sitting in front of the entire collection of human knowledge, and you're asking me. Like, as much as I appreciate your, faith in my ability to answer that question,
right?
Your ability to find the answer should be much better than my ability to answer it. And if it's not, then that's what we should be working on today. And it's just like I'm like, yeah, I don't have 3 hours, but man, sometimes I think, you should be able to find it. You're sitting in front of a computer, or you have your phone next to you. Like, you should be able to find anything you need and make it work. And yeah, so that's an interesting thought process in terms of how we respond to students who, and we kind of reward, I think, in some ways, the I don't know, or the move on, like, because we feel like we have to move on.
Right.
And your professor's just like, oh, we've got all day. We can just stay here till, I can stay here till 9 o'clock at night, and we'll see you next week. And we'll spend the next 3 hours next week doing the same thing.
I know.
He just spent the entire semester on that, I bet.
Oh, he could have. And I think and the other part of it was, he had me finish that case. And just when I thought I was done, he had me start the next case. And I was like, oh. And I read everything. I mean, I read, I had study guide, you name it. But you can't, a lot of times we study and we prepare for the way it's written and expect it to come back to us in that same format. And sometimes it does, but you're not really showing that you're learning and that you can apply it and extend it. And that's where like my cutoff point was at that point. So it forced me to kind of push. And plus, now having the law degree, I can, analyze a lot of student behaviors with all the different courses I had. So it's kind of funny.
I mean, that's such an interesting facet of, your journey and specific to you, because I don't think there are that many high school Spanish teachers who also are licensed attorneys and, pass the bar in their state. And I don't think that's a common thing. But it makes you unique in a lot of ways. And so moving past that, you feel, you said, you kind of looked at things a little differently. You moved into, kind of, I guess, the next phase of your career almost, where you're, you said, all right, well, I've passed the bar. I did that. Now what? I mean, and it sounds to me like you would imagine you were looking for the next challenge after that. Because if you're anything like me, once you finish the thing, you're moving on to the next thing so you can start doing whatever it is.
Right.
Or you're doing all the things at the same time.
Yeah.
So what after law school? Like what was the next thing for you? Because it seems like you're going to need something next to challenge you.
I know. And what's funny is I never got a master's. Like I had the bachelor's and I had beyond, I think when I started teaching, I had the bachelor's plus 30, but I never really looked into getting a master's degree because after, taking all the Spanish and French courses, I didn't really see that would how it would benefit me. And I wanted to do something different, and so that I got
bump to the right on the scale.
Yeah. And a lot of times people think that, oh, well, you have your doctorate, but that doesn't count when it comes to, salary for teachers because it's not a doctorate in education. So I still need that master's at some point, but I just didn't know what in. And my love of technology and being an 80s child kind of kicked in there and I don't really remember what I started to look, but I know I relied on Google, because we always go to Google or something, and looking for some type of program to take. And I found that Duquesne had a master's in instructional technology course, educational technology. And I looked into it, and most of it was able to be done online. I think there were 2 or 3 classes where I had to go once in a while to learn. But I thought, okay. And so, all of that kind of tied back into the teaching, but an interesting mix, especially with Spanish, a lot of people, when they graduate from high school, college, they've had foreign language, they'll say, oh, I had this many years of language and I don't remember a thing. And so being realistic, and teaching in my classes, I want them to be able to understand and speak the language they're learning. My hope is that they go beyond that and realize that it can help them in other areas of their life. You don't know 5-10 years from now what you're going to do, that you might need a foreign language, or even with our own language, with English, a lot of times you can look at the words and figure out the meaning. And beyond that, giving them other skills like technology. I got so tired of them using translators to find things, to translate things. And I took courses in machine translation. So it's another funny thing is that sometimes I've had students hand me a paper with the the page facing them upside down, and I can just catch 1 or 2 words, and I'll say, use the translator. They're like, how do you know that? I'm like, well, I can see a certain verb, in Spanish 1, they're not going to be able to narrate in past tense or future tense. Or a computer doesn't understand context. And so one time, the student said oh, I'll be right back. But the back was the body back. And I'm like, that doesn't even make any sense. So trying to find a way to not push technology away for them, but to embrace it and leverage it in a way that actually is beneficial. So I got a smart board, and all I was having them do was play games. I'm like, there has to be something more. So all of that kind of played into why I pursued the master's. So you're right. I always need to move on to some other, I like to learn. But there was a running joke in my family for a long time. I was like, well, I'm going to go to school because, Latin, foreign languages, but no.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
I assume at some point somewhere at Duquesne there's a building with your name on it at this point.
No, there should be. No, I'm kidding. No.
But yeah, so you did that, and you kind of took what was a personal interest and turned it into something you could use in your classroom, which is your interest in enjoyment of technology, and then kind of turn that into something you do in classrooms. So how did it come about that you started teaching STEAM? I mean, was it oh, you teach Spanish, so obviously you'll be good at this, or was it you have a master's in instructional technology and we just need somebody to do this because somebody needs to do this? It
was kind of a little bit of both of those. You're asking me these great questions. They make me laugh because they always make me think of the story. So with STEAM, my school had gotten a grant to redesign the library and to make it more of a makerspace. And so, of course, going from STEM to STEAM, the A with arts was going to be foreign languages. And so my principal had called me into the office to talk to me about how they were going to transition it used to be an exploratory languages program, but they were going to move it into a STEAM rotation where students would have, different things like a makey, I forget what, connects or something like that. And then he wanted to talk to me about having me teach culture with French and Spanish and teach hummingbirds. And when he said that, the only thing I could think of were the hummingbirds that I've seen on my deck in the summer. I had no idea what he meant. And I didn't let him know that I didn't know either. I was like, oh yeah, it sounds great. And I'm thinking like, what am I going to have hummingbirds do?
God, yeah.
So I went and I Googled it and I figured it out. So for a year, I taught, a year, 7th and 8th graders to program hummingbird robots, but tied into some kind of cultural theme related to French or Spanish or anything like that. So that was the first year. And then they decided to move that down another grade. And he said, well, what do you want to teach? And I named like 10 different things related to technology that I wanted to teach. He's like, well, what do you want? Which one? I said, all of them. So now my course is emerging technology. And so we go through things like digital citizenship, gaming, coding. I do a ton with artificial intelligence, AR, VR, and then just basic skills. I mean, it's not like all at once. There are some students that don't know how to attach a picture or a file into an email or to take a screenshot. So I teach them a lot of the basics, but we also do a lot with like creation with different tools instead of like, they want to use PowerPoint. And I'm like, okay, PowerPoint, it's a good skill to be able to use because businesses and schools use that. But, as far as creativity, like let's try, and then we do something else. So it's awesome for me.
Else besides PowerPoint.
Yeah. I had an 8th grader argue with me last year that, the Buncee and PowerPoint were the exact same thing. And he said, I can do the same thing with PowerPoint that you could do with Buncee. And I said, okay. And I love the fact that he was like questioning it. Yeah, I know. I didn't pull that out though. But in the end, he was like, well, okay, you win. And I said, well, it's not about winning. I said, how
good your programming skills now.
yeah, but he did show me. He said, well, I could put a picture in and I can do this. And I said, yeah, you can do the same thing. But the difference is like, let's look at the time factor, it's one element of it. And so then at the end, he's like, well, you win. I said, no, it's not about winning. It's getting you to see what other options are available and then deciding which one you like the best. That's it.
And then you threw your arms up in the air and were like, yes, no.
Winner.
Winner. No. But yeah, that sounds a lot like a lot of the things that I've been doing in the past couple of years, which is, it's so much fun. I did some like tech integration type work where I was doing kind of whatever I could. The first year was more like, how can I convince people to let me do things with their class, like crazy things that they don't think actually make any sense, but I promise they do. And then the second year it was like, hey, do you have anything you want to do with my class? Because you can take them whenever you want. And that was really awesome to switch to that. And then this year, obviously, I switched from that role to teaching 6th graders, teach like that little, like the overview kind of course where you're talking about where you teach them basic computing skills and also a little bit of everything. But then I also teach like robotics. So, and it was like, you're going to teach Lego, you can teach kids how to make robots and build robots. I'm like, am I going to have supplies or are we going to build them out of trash? Because we could do both, but I don't know how to do one. So
oh my gosh.
Figure that out whenever you decide. And it just kind of happens like that. So really interesting that you can kind of and your AR, VR and some of the tech stuff you've done with your classes where we've kind of connected in the past. And so talk about this, the next thing, I guess, was you're kind of, writing 19,000 books at the moment. Or 3 or 17 or whatever you want to call it. You can call it 1,000. It's fine. But at least 3, maybe more. How did that even happen?
That's an excellent question. No, actually, when I was probably 18 or 19, you know how like when you watch the Olympics or something, and you see the people doing all these great things, like say ice skating, you're like, oh, it looks so easy. I could totally do that. I read books and I thought I could be a writer, but I tried to write.
I can write one.
Yeah. And the problem was I was trying, like at that time, I was trying to write similar to the styles of the books that I was reading. And like, I clearly was not a John Grisham or Mary Higgins Clark, or Beverly Cleary. Yeah. When I was a kid. So I didn't really think about it then, but then probably 6 or 7 years ago when I started to do like some presentations at conferences and was using some of these different tech tools, I started to reach out to some of these different companies to get, just to get information, like, are you used, like SurveyMonkey was the first one, which, how many times, people have taken surveys using that, But I started to use it in my classes to have students reflect on things we had done. I made up a quiz with it, and I just said to them, hey, does anybody ever use it for this? And so they asked me to write a blog. And I didn't even know what a blog was. Like, I didn't know what it stood for. This is like, okay. And it had to be
that stands for something?
Yeah. I had no idea. And so they asked me to write one of like 700 words. I'm like, oh my goodness, 700 words. So that was the first one that I'd written. And then of course, once you start, you're like, oh, maybe I'll be a blogger, but what would I write about? And over, probably a 3 or 4 year, I know, anything you want. And that's the thing, like people think that, oh, well, nobody would read it. Well, maybe one person would read it. Well, that's still one person that then it might help that one person. So
and my mom gets to know what I do for a living, and it's great.
Yeah, I know. I do share with my parents all the time. They're probably like, seriously, another one. But I just started to write different blogs on, of my own, and then send some to like Teach Thought or different sites that I read, just to share some ideas like what I was doing in the classroom, like how to integrate technology or tools for assessment. I mean, just whatever came to my mind, I would just create and write, and still not really thinking about writing a book. And then probably maybe 2 years ago, I thought about writing something about like how I started, just putting that into a book form for somebody who might be kind of like, oh, I don't really know where to start. But then at the same time, I thought, well, nobody would read it. And then I just kept writing blogs, and I write for 5 different publications now, which is a lot of writing, but it's okay. Like I enjoy it. And then just different opportunities came up. I created a proposal for one publisher and sent that out just to see. And I'm still kind of working on that one, but the other ones just kind of all popped up around the same time, like the conversations happened. And then the contracts came like within the same 2 weeks. And so that's how that story happened.
They just all kind of fell into place at the same time.
But it's chaotic, but it's great because like whenever you get to that point where you're like, oh, I just, I have that writer's block, I can't think. All I got to do is go to the other tab and see if I can think about anything in that document.
You're like, well, that's interesting, because I know when I wrote my book, I had the same issue. There were times I just didn't know what else to write about that section. So I would I wrote my book, and I jumped from section to section to section until I got closer to the end of it, where I was like, all right, I need to finish this part.
Right.
But the beginning, I just wrote whenever I felt like writing about a thing, I just went to that section and wrote about it.
Mm-hmm.
It gets a little chaotic, but it's nice to be able to jump from place to place.
Yeah.
So that's it. So what are they about? I mean, what are these 3 different books going to be about? How did you have 3 different topics even at all to to discuss? And obviously you have millions of topics to discuss, but
yeah. Well, I don't even remember which order at this point. Well, I kind of do.
Just whatever order, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. No,
we're not judging them by your favorite, because
no.
first we're just judging it by the first one that popped in your head in the middle of talking.
The first one was that I officially signed to was to write Unconventional is the title. And with Mark Barnes and the Times 10 publications, Chuck Poole has created a new series, and his book Unforgettable just came out. I guess it's been about a month now, and he created this new series. It's the series. And so I spoke with him. I had a couple of ideas, and I spoke with him through Skype back at the end of August, I think it was, about writing something about unconventional and changing things up in the classroom and just doing things, not the conventional or traditional way. And so that's the one that I've been working on the longest. And then I had also spoken with Marlena Gross-Taylor from EduGladiators a while back about writing a book under EduGladiators. And so that one is going to be, I don't have the definite title yet. It's still a work in progress, but it's just basically talking about the future is now. How are we preparing for education? Going through, and I have a lot of quotes that are in it. I have some educators that have written short vignettes. I actually have one of my students who's now a senior, who for the past 5 years has gone to conferences and presented with me, but also presented instead of me to room full of educators, administrators. And so she actually was going to write a vignette, and it turned into a full chapter, which is like amazing as a senior in high school. Fantastic. So that's probably the thing the most excited about. And I also have a book with EduMatch that I pitched. It's going to be called In Other Words, and how quotes led to rethinking education, or how quotes can lead you to rethink education. So it's all centered on quotes. also has vignettes and some chapters that people are writing for that one as well. But I think my favorite thing about it is, there are so many lessons that we learn from other people, members of our PLN, and, what they stand for. And a lot of the times those people aren't really sharing their stories other than with you and not, anywhere else. And I felt like these are the stories that people need to hear, like what people are experiencing in the classroom, what students think about being in the classroom. And so I kind of picked quotes. I asked if anybody wanted to be involved. There are some people I specifically said, would you please write something? Just because I really admire what you do, or I know their story. And so it hit me like 2 weeks ago. I was driving home and I thought, man, I got to put all this together. It's not just my writing for 2 of the books. I'm gathering everybody else's, writing and editing it and trying to fit it into mine. So, they're distinct in terms of the topic or the way they're being written, but the underlying focus of a lot of them, there's a lot of similarities between them, or commonalities, I guess you could say, between them.
And I think that's probably common in any collection of stories and educators, and there's a lot of similarities and things that you can identify, threads that weave through a lot of the same stories together.
Right.
I think that's part of what unites us and makes us a profession where we can build and rely off one another, is that our stories do connect, and that we do find a lot of commonalities with one another. So really, that's really interesting. And just, I imagine just overwhelming a little bit to some degree, because there's so much going on. And somebody asked me the other day about whether or not I was looking for people to write stories for something that I'm doing, or if I just wanted them to contribute some thought, idea, story type things. And I'm thinking, no, I can't do that with the other people and the stories. You tell me the stories, I will quote you and adapt to the things, but I don't know if I can handle waiting around for other people to finish their writing, because I've been the person who has, I tell people when they're like, hey, will you write something for me? I say, all right, when do you need it by?
Yeah.
All right, well, okay, there's the date. I said, if you don't have it for me this date, start harassing me about it, because if it's not urgent, it gets pushed to the back. And then,
right.
So I'm like, you just got to tell me, hey. So I'm like, I don't want to be that. I don't want to be that person. I know I wouldn't be good at it. So I'm like, I wouldn't be something I'd be good at. But I can imagine between your own writing and then having to go through other people's work and kind of weave it together.
Yeah.
Is enough diversity in those tasks, I guess, to keep you interested every single day.
Mm-hmm.
And on top, and that's probably really helpful. So. I think you've given so many things to think about in terms of, there's so many interesting points to your career, and we could probably have spent a lot longer talking about each one of them. But I guess where I would go now is one of the things I like to ask people about, and this is something I tend to ask people basically because a lot of the people who are listening to this, most of the people are educators. A lot of the educators that listen to this podcast are dealing with a lot of things. People who I've talked to say, oh yeah, I love listening to this because it reframes the way that I think about what I'm doing. Right. And when I'm going through a difficult thing, or I'm having that Monday morning where I just don't want to get going, and I listen to somebody talk about stuff on the way into work, and I feel so much better. So if you were talking to one of those people who either is new at all this, or maybe just needs a boost, what would the recommendation, what would the advice be to those people that you would give them?
Well, number one is, you need to have somebody to talk to, like a PLN. I think that's critical. And it's another thing that I didn't always realize. Teaching can be such an isolating profession. And a lot of times, people are not really excited, or I don't want to say excited. They're just, saying, oh, this didn't go well, or I'm struggling with this. A lot of people don't come up with saying that right away because it shows maybe like signs of weakness, or you're embarrassed. And if you're doing that alone and you're just kind of like thinking that, it can really, pull you down. So a lot of the times, I think the best thing is having that PLN and having a group that you know that you can trust, and just saying that you need to talk or whatever it is, like through Voxer, I mean, there's always somebody that's there no matter what group you're in. But having a source to go to, yeah, it's all the time. I mean, people are around the world, but that's the biggest thing. And for me, for many years, I did have some struggles in different areas like time management and with behavior. And it forced me, not really forced me, it wasn't my decision, but I ended up withdrawing more and just staying in my room and keeping to myself. And, and that's not the way to go. Like, you need to connect, and you need to find some way to, give yourself time to either forget about what it is that might be giving you troubles at school, or if there's some kind of struggles, and just do something different, or get into some type of routine. For me, a lot of there's times that, getting up in the morning early, that's tough. It doesn't matter how much sleep you get, especially on a Monday morning, you're just oh my gosh. But honestly, even if I feel tired or whatever on the way to work, I just think about my day or the students and stuff. And I mean, they lift me up. Sometimes it's just ridiculous behaviors or a Fortnite dance or whatever the latest craze is. But you just have to find some point to start with each day, or something to focus on that's a positive. And I have people who every day, they'll send out a tweet in the morning. It's a quote for the day that's positive, and just because they know that their friends are the ones reading that. That's all it takes.
Absolutely. I think there's so much good to one, having people that you can talk to. I think trust, I think you mentioned that was such an important aspect of that, because you don't want to tell people you don't trust that, I have no idea what's going on right now, or this is a disaster or whatever. So that's really important. And then you said, I've definitely been in the place where I just close the door and don't talk to anybody, and all right, I'm going to get through the day, and drains you out. It really drains you. So it's important, I think, to reach out, to find at least someone who you can have those conversations with. Hopefully more than one someone, but just to have some people. I think is really, really important. So thank you for sharing that. That thought is a great reminder to just don't be alone, and really make sure that if you have people that you're reaching out to them, especially if you're the person, you reach out to those people, because you never know when that person's going to need you to reach out to them.
Right.
Or post something that's going to make them think of you or whatever. It's just, that's all great stuff. So, Rachelle, thank you so much for all the things you've shared tonight. Just incredible stories, really interesting things that you've gone through and experienced throughout your career. Lots of amazing things still yet to come. I am really excited that we get to, connect and hang out a couple times in the near future, in person, in real life.
Finally, right?
Yeah, seriously. So it'll be a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to doing that soon. But
thank you.
And thanks so much for joining me. And just one last thing, people who want to connect with you, learn more about what you do, or what they can, what the many things you have coming out in the future, how would they reach you?
Well, I'm very consistent, and it's kind of funny when somebody asked me this summer at ISTE about email or something like that. I was like, well, I started with AOL, and I just followed what my parents did. So I've kept everything very consistent. So whether it's Twitter or Voxer, my Gmail or my website, it's always RDENE 915. First letter of my first name, my middle name, and birth date, Dene 915, on all of those platforms.
So if you want to find Rachelle, you're going to Dene 915 for everything. And that's where you can find her writing and her work and her amazing things that she's sharing, and all the great stuff that's going to be coming out from her in the near future and for some time to come. So thanks so much for sharing again, and we'll catch everybody next time on The Teacher's Journey.
Thank you.